Susanna, let's hear from your young days. I mean, your very first recollections of any music in the home.
Well, when my father was working, he worked at home except when he was in Hollywood writing film scores. So there was always music in the house. He worked at the piano. He had a table and a ashtray for cigarettes. That was a definite, had to be there. So there was always music in the house, and I always heard what he was doing.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because from, I think, your early childhood, you were perhaps aware pretty soon that he was an unusual person as an artist. That's to say that he was an artistic man and also a very creative person.
Well, I was very aware of my father's creativity, and even as a young child, I always loved his music. I was at home when he was writing Ballet Ballads and Golden Apple, and I heard all of it, and I loved it at the time. I mean, I always thought he wrote wonderful music.
Now, it would be nice to actually just hear a little bit also about your mother, and you might even like to tell us, if you feel you want to, how it was that Jerome and Hazel actually met in the first place and got married.
My father met my mother when he was in Hollywood. She worked at a bookstore called the Stanley Rose Bookstore, which back in the mid-30s was sort of a gathering place for intellectuals. And people just went there, and he met her there. They got married in 1939 in New York. They had a wonderful relationship. They had a very, very intense, close relationship. My father was, I don't think he realized how much he depended on her. She was definitely his right hand, even though she wasn't a musician. I mean, whenever he would finish a section of a piece or something, he would always call her in to listen to it.
Isn't that nice? One thing that's very interesting is that listening to the interviews of him for the first time, after having learned his music, I now feel when I hear those interviews and I hear his charm, his culture, his wit, his depth, his gentle quality, but his strong quality, I suddenly think, yes, now I really know how he wrote music. If you see what I'm saying, he seems absolutely to be an extension there of his music, you know?
My father was definitely an intellectual. He was a very brilliant man. He, graduated early from school and all of that, went to Juilliard. But he was, the essence of him was a cultural, intellectual person. He was always reading, he was always thinking, going to every type of art show, concerts, whatever, in New York. Not just the big things, but the offbeat stuff. And he was interested in everything, including science, and he loved baseball, and, he was kind of an all-around guy.
And you hear that, don't you, in one of the interviews, which, we've discovered for this program, which I think is such a revelation, his memories of Bertolt Brecht and of Kurt Weill, and then when he refers just at one moment, just in passing, how he loved Schnitzler, and he quotes some of those Schnitzler plays and things. This is very, I think, important for the colors and the character of his music, don't you? Because Moross is famous, I know not famous enough, but famous for his American qualities. That's what everyone says. But I've always said, and I'd love to hear whether you think I'm wrong or right on this, I've always felt that there is more to his music than just that. That there is, I think I've said it to you before, this interview, that there is in him a deep root quality that I feel in the music that goes back to his genes of being Jewish, Russian Jewish. I feel that there is, particularly in the pathos, and particularly in the warmth, but yes, the pathos, the melancholy. So I'd love to hear whether you feel that I may be right or wrong on that. But yes, of course it's so American, but there's more to it than just that.
Well, he certainly has the classical tradition in the writing of his music. I mean, he studied all the classical forms and whatnot, so he understood how to use form. And I always think of him, though, as really Americana. That's what comes to my mind most of all.
Yes, and yet he's very, I think, don't you, he's very different from the composer who, of course, believed in him enormously at the beginning of his career, who was Copland, because one could say that Copland was very American, but I feel with Jerome Moross that there's a wonderful, there's such a romantic beauty to so much of what he's written, you know? Yeah.
I would have to agree with you on that.
At the very beginning, he was studying, wasn't he, a great deal of the avant-garde composers of the time. He was, quite immersed, I think, in Schoenberg and also Stravinsky, but particularly in Schoenberg. And at the very first work, it's very interesting if you hear the Everlasting Blues, which I do want to include on this program, because actually he went away from that style pretty quickly. And then when we hear only a couple of years later that extraordinary Beguine, this strange, almost phantasmagorical kind of imagination. So it's interesting that he started to compose much more melodically after those very early works.
My father was fooling around with, the 12-tone avant-garde composers for, when he was very young, and he and Benny Herman got to know Charles Ives and played his music and visited him and worked on his scores. But he very quickly lost interest in all of that and went his own way. And he really believed, and I remember hearing him say this, that there was always another tune to be written. And he always had another tune.
That's marvelous to say that, that somebody believes there's another tune to be written and you've always got another tune. Now, how many composers can you actually say that of? There wasn't there a wonderful fund of melody, and his melodies, Susanna, didn't they? That's what I love about his music. His melodies related nearly always to a situation. I mean, he was a born theatre composer, wasn't he? His melodies came out of the situations and the characters that he portrayed.
He loved writing for the theatre. I think that was his favorite genre, but he loved writing for ballet. He loved writing films. I think he was happiest when he was doing something that related to a story, to a drama. I mean, he was talking about writing a second symphony, which was going to be a vocal symphony based on the life of Amerigo Vespucci. Now, he never got to do that, but that was what his thinking was. That was what his interests were.
Can we just look at Frankie and Johnny for a moment? This is such a daring concept for the time. In fact, we see several times in his career that he's looking ahead in a prophetic sort of way, because here he's portraying the very essence of certain elements of American society, but in a post-war way, to me, although it's written in 1938, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, in a way that we heard much more after the war with other composers. It's very ironic. In many ways, it's very, very cruel, actually. And at the same time, the cruelty isn't unpleasant cruelty, but it is an exposé of the, shall we say, unacceptable view that mankind has of unfortunate people. I find that very remarkable, the way that is expressed. And the whole thing of the dancers being expected to do much more than just dance. It's so ahead of its time, isn't it?
At the time, it was considered very risque. One of the amusing things, and I think my father thought it was amusing, was to have the 3 Salvation Army girls. They were not actually dancers. They were sort of, as he called them, Salvation Susies, and they marched around on the stage. So it is kind of a unique piece. And it was a huge success. It ran for 6 weeks in Chicago, which was something that was unheard of. The other interesting thing to me about the piece is that it's kind of a feminist statement. At the end, the moral of the story is you can't put no trust in any man. And in The Last Judgement, which was a ballet that he wrote for Ruth Page in the 50s. It's also kind of a feminist piece in the ballet, Adam and Eve. It's the story of Adam and Eve, but in the end, Eve is exonerated of original sin because Adam has sold his soul for power, and she's beatified. So I think that was a part of my father's character. He really was kind of an equal opportunity guy. I never felt any time in my home that he had any, negative attitude towards women, and that was long before the women's movement started.
Well, now, it's interesting that the next big stage work he did, of course, was even more daring, wasn't it? And that is the Ballet Ballads. This work fascinates me so much. The three ballets in themselves are also different. And once again, the concept here of having artists do things that went beyond the norm of what was expected of them, that's very, very forward-looking, isn't it?
Well, the two shows, Ballet Ballads and Golden Apple, were very, very forward at the time, and they were not commercial successes, but they were artistic successes, and theatrical people looked at them, and a lot of what they did was copied in a sense. But the idea was to merge song and dance into one unit so that you didn't know where one ended and the other began, which is why there's a singing Susanna and a dancing Susanna for Susanna and the Elders. There's a singing Willie and a dancing Willie for Willie the Weeper. He's the alter ego. And they are through sung. It's interesting because the first time I went to see Cats, I was absolutely thrilled in a way because I thought, well, 30 years later, here's what my father and Touche did, and it's a huge success, and everybody thinks it's just wonderful, and they did it 30 years earlier. So I found that very exciting.
Exactly. That's just what I was kind of getting at, that, this extraordinary prophetic way that on several occasions we see with your father that he was experimenting in something that much later became almost the sort of norm with the more modern view of doing things. And it was such an enlightened idea, Well, I mean, quite apart from that, the actual music, the characterization and the music in those three works, I find, once again, what fascinates me so much is that he responds, as a true theatre composer does, to the situation and the characters and creates a completely different colour in the orchestra and style in the orchestra each time. The inventiveness, the originality, and also the discipline. It's concise music, It's tight.
Do you want me to talk about his orchestration experience and how that helped
Yes,
him?
I was coming to that because that's really the next thing on the list, isn't it, chronologically? Yes, please do.
My parents went to California in 1939, late in 1939, because there really wasn't anything happening in New York, and my father didn't have any work, so they went to California, where everybody was going to California, to Hollywood, to find work. And he couldn't find scoring work at the beginning, and he became an orchestrator. And he orchestrated a lot of films for many years, and he always felt that that was fabulous training because he could orchestrate something in the morning and hear it in the afternoon. And that way he could hear, what worked, what didn't work. And he always felt that even though he had had a lot of orchestration training when he went to Juilliard, this was really wonderful training, and he really was a marvelous orchestrator.
Yes, he was so extraordinary with his orchestration. Particularly in the films, for instance, the actual orchestration of different films, according to the different subjects of those films, is much more than just surface. It's actually creating the expression. That's the word I'm looking for,
Well, he definitely had the ability to create a mood. I mean, if you think about the music for The Warlord, which is supposed to be the 12th century. And as he said in an interview somewhere that, you know, nobody really knew what the music was at that time. But when you hear that score, you think, well, yes, that's the 12th century, you know.
Yes. It's extraordinary to read and to hear him actually say in these interviews that in the early days, Hollywood, at first, before he became really involved with Hollywood, found him too avant-garde. They found him too modern, that he was too sophisticated. Extraordinary, isn't it?
It certainly was. When he came to Hollywood, he was a young man. Maybe he was considered too avant-garde, but it was also difficult to break into the movies as a composer. There were established composers who had studio contracts, and, you know, it's like any other field. It's hard to break in.
But coming out of what you've said there is something important, because Jerome Moross was his own man all through his life. And one of the most amazing things he says in one of his interviews is, you know, he enjoyed the films. There were difficult things. There were people who messed him about. There were things done to his music that he didn't approve and wasn't even asked about. But you know, I get the impression from what he says that he enjoyed them. He responded. If the story was good, at any rate, he responded and enjoyed it. But then he says, but after about 10 years, I'd had enough of that. I wanted to compose what I wanted to compose. It's inside my soul. Well, I think that's incredible. How many other people would do that? Because it's turning down a lot of money, isn't it?
One of the things that I admire, and my husband has made this point, he always did what he wanted to do. He paid a price for it because he didn't have the kind of success that he would have liked. He didn't write the standard book shows, so he didn't have the huge successes that he might have had. He didn't stay in Hollywood after the big country because he wanted to go back to New York. And there were opportunities waiting for him after the big country. If he had stayed in Hollywood, it was a big success. He probably could have had a very big career, but he chose not to. So, you know, he made choices, and he did what he wanted to do, and he wrote the kind of music he wanted to write. After the Symphony CD came out, I read a review somewhere that said Moross never changed his style for 40 years. And I thought, I don't know whether that's a compliment or an insult, but I thought that was a compliment because he was true to himself.
Let's have a talk about the Golden Apple. There again, this is something that was new, wasn't it? And was a prototype for lots of other things later on.
Well, the Golden Apple followed Ballet Ballads, and it was a through-sung show, very Americana. Takes place in 1900 in the state of Washington. The first act is based on Homer's Iliad. The second act is based on the Odyssey, but it uses all kinds of American things like Gallagher and Sheen routine and all kinds of variety of dancing, and it has a true Americana flavor.
It's also, I think, got a lot of overtones of melancholy in it, which certainly comes through in the original cast recording. Now, everybody knows Lazy Afternoon. I think there have been about 160 recordings of that.
Something like that.
Yeah, but if you hear Kay Ballard singing it, she's still very different to all the others in that there is an element of sadness, of wistfulness is a much better word. There's always that overtone and slight undertone that brings tears to your eyes, which needs a particular kind of performer, I think, you know?
Well, you have to remember when you hear that recording, Kay in the show is actually acting. I mean, she's in the middle of a seduction scene with Paris. So there are things going on the stage, you know, that other singers are singing the song, and they're putting their own interpretation on it, but she was actually singing it in the show, and it was directed and staged as a seduction scene.
It's a pity, isn't it, that the recording company at the time, I think it was RCA, only issued something like, I think they recorded less than a third in the studio of the show, really.
They refused to put out a 2 record album at the time. So this was the mid-50s, and it really is too bad because people know the show. It has a certain, I don't know if you want to say cult status. I mean, I hear from people all the time, you see it, you know, they wish there were another recording. They'd love to hear the whole thing. Yeah, there is a vocal score available through Alfred Music if people are interested.
It's also amazing, isn't it, how with John La Touche they updated a Greek mythology that really made it relate to fairly contemporary United States, okay, 50 years earlier, but, you know, reasonably contemporary, make it really American, make it gently satirical, in some ways, quite sort of critical in some ways, but the word that comes to mind with me is do all that with such a great affection that it seems to me they've really captured the social qualities of the American people, you know?
My father felt that Touche was the most brilliant poet lyricist of the 20th century. I mean, he was a brilliant man. His lyrics are marvelous, and the lyrics in Ballet Ballads, some of the songs are available on the recording Windflowers. And if you hear lyrics like Oh Baby, Gee Baby, and I've Got Me, they're really, he was brilliant, very witty. He was a wonderful man.
And your father was witty too, wasn't he? In a gentle but very sharp way, I feel.
Yes, in a different way from Touche. He was a witty person. When he was with friends and family, when he had to make a public appearance, he tended to be quite shy.
And then in the last years, he, as he said in one of the interviews, writes what he wants to write for himself, just sort of privately. And, well, I just spoke to you about this the other day. I find the Piano Quintet a particularly beautiful and interesting and fascinating work, coming as it did out of that film, Forget-Me-Not.
My father had a friend who was actually in the advertising business, and he decided to make a short film, and he did. It's called Forget-Me-Not. It never had any distribution, and unfortunately the actor who played the lead was terrible. It was a silent film. But it was very sweet and charming, and he asked my father to write the music. And I guess my father liked it because he said he would write the music, you know, and get paid out of future royalties. But it was clear there weren't going to be any future royalties. And he wrote a piano quintet, and he got 5 of his friends to play it, who probably also knew there weren't going to be any future royalties, but they did it as a favor. And it's a lovely piece. It's very nice. It was recorded.
The film, it was rather a sad story, wasn't it?
Right.
A widower's memories of his wife, I think.
The piece, I eventually was able to separate the piece from the movie and from the film, and it was recorded on Bay Cities. Unfortunately, it's not available now, except I guess on eBay or something.
Yeah. And let's have a look at the chamber works at the end. You see, he wrote a sonata for piano duet and string quartet. I can find no other example of any composer anywhere who'd done that, who'd written for a piano duet and a string quartet.
Over the years, I've had the opportunity to meet a lot of duo piano teams, and I've asked them about it, and they all agree that there are not any other examples of a piece with piano duet and string quartet. I don't know what prompted him to write it. Unfortunately, I never asked him about it, but it is a wonderful piece, and people do love it.
And I love the Flute Concerto. And now you see here again, right at the very end of his life, he writes a piece that is very, to my ears, a mixture of the American folk music, but it's very French to me in many ways. He understands the flute in that real French style. It's got such a light airiness. You know, it sounds like the work of a young man. It is the most creative, and it spins melody after melody. I love that piece.
It's interesting about that piece because, and it's interesting about a lot of my father's music, particularly the chamber music. They need to be played with kind of a jazz feeling. And I've heard the Flute Concerto played kind of flat, and it's not as interesting as, for instance, when Alexa Still plays it on the Albany Records recording. He always had kind of a sense of jazz in his music.
Oh, yes. I think so. But again, a certain pathos in the jazz as well as the exuberance. You see, it's all part of, to me, a very sophisticated composing palette for me, you know? And it leads me really to the last topic, which is Sorry, Wrong Number. Now, this is a very, in my view, remarkable piece.
Sorry, Wrong Number is based on the radio play of the same name by Louise Fletcher, who was actually Bernard Herrmann's first wife and had been a good friend of my father's because he was good friends with Benny Herrmann. It was the first time that he set a play to music, and he enjoyed doing it, and it's an interesting piece. He had planned to have that as part of a longer evening, but never managed to do that. He had gotten the rights to a play by Susan Glaspell, and he was going to set that to music. But unfortunately, he got ill and passed away before that happened.
Yes, it's a challenging piece, and of course, you know, it's a pretty scary story, which is what interests me, in that in this instance, he does something that I find very fascinating, in that he almost misleads you early on to thinking it's going to be lightweight, and then you start to realize how scary it is. This is a sign of a great dramatist, I think.
The story is a scary story because it's the story of a woman who's in bed. She can't get out of bed, and her husband sends someone to kill her, and she can't get any help. So, yeah, it is kind of a scary story.
But you know what's very interesting about it also? The claustrophobia of it. That's to say, you know, that it's really basically one person. I mean, interestingly enough, you know, Poulenc wrote La Voix Humaine, which is, of course, just one woman at the end of the phone. Now, what is, I think, very interesting is here that I think Moross is more successful, actually, in this work, because you actually don't quite know how it's going to end, although you have an awful feeling of presentiment all the way through, a feeling of portent that it is going to end terribly, but he keeps you waiting until finally, you know, it really is bad at the end. And I think that dramatic pacing is tremendous in this piece. I was really riveted listening through to it, even though the sound quality is, you know, very poor, unfortunately, on that recording. But if you fiddle around with it and you doctor it, as I can do, you get, the drama comes across. It's quite remarkable. And we wish, if he'd lived longer, he'd have written more works like that.
I can't remember the name of the Susan Glaspell play, but he had gotten the rights to it. Sorry, Wrong Number is a marvelous vehicle for a soprano because she gets to sit there and sing for 45 minutes, and the whole piece revolves around her being on the stage pretty much alone most of the time. If you want me to just add a comment.
Please do.
Although I never really made the opportunity to interview my father or talk to him at great length about his music, I always knew as an only child that I would be in charge of it. And I always loved it and I always believed in it. And I'm really thrilled that it's now being heard and played, and more people are having the opportunity to listen to it. And this radio documentary is very exciting for me.
Well, Susanna, thank you very, very much indeed. It's been wonderful.
It has been, John. I've had fun.